It is 4 in the morning on April 16, 1945. Along the Oder River, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany, a tense, unnatural silence reigns. For the soldiers of the First Belarusian Front, crammed into their trenches, it is the calm before the final storm. They have marched thousands of kilometers from the ruins of Stalingrad, the taste of ash and vengeance in their throats. Berlin is only 60 kilometers away. For the German defenders, a desperate mix of hardened veterans, Hitler Youth teenagers, and old men of the Volkssturm, it is the stillness of the world's end. They know what is coming. They have heard the rumors, the endless grinding of tank treads, the dull rumble of a power massing in the darkness. Then, the world is torn apart. 40,000 Soviet cannons and mortars, one piece of artillery for every 4 meters of the front, open fire simultaneously. The night sky becomes a roaring white day. The earth heaves like a wounded animal. A torrent of steel and high explosive, the most intense bombardment in the history of warfare, crashes down on the German positions. This is not an artillery barrage. It is an act of annihilation. For the Soviet soldier, every shell that screams overhead is retribution for Leningrad, for Moscow, for the burned villages and murdered families. It is the culmination of 4 years of unspeakable brutality. For the German defender, it is the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. It is the final proof that their Führer has abandoned them to an apocalypse of his own making. The Red Army has arrived at the gates of Berlin, not just as a conquering army, but as an instrument of judgment. The battle for the capital of the 1,000-year Reich has begun, and it will be an agony. In early April 1945, the war in Europe had a single center of gravity: Berlin. For the Western Allies, it was a strategic objective of diminishing importance. For Joseph Stalin, it was everything. It was the ultimate political prize, the unambiguous symbol of Soviet victory. He wanted the red flag flying over the Reichstag before any American or Briton set foot in the city. But Stalin was not a simple strategist. He was a master of intrigue, a puppet master who delighted in manipulating the ambitions of his subordinates. And he had 2 marshals, 2 titans of war, ready to be unleashed: Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. Zhukov was the savior of Moscow, the hero of Stalingrad, the most famous marshal in the Soviet Union. He was brutal, meticulous, a devout believer in the doctrine of overwhelming force. To him, the capture of Berlin was his destiny, the crown jewel that would confirm his place in history as Russia's greatest general. His approach was direct, a sledgehammer blow designed to pulverize anything in its path, regardless of the cost in lives. Konev was the eternal rival, a master of swift, audacious maneuver, a cunning and flexible tank commander. Where Zhukov was the hammer, Konev was the sharp spear. He resented Zhukov's fame and saw Berlin as his one chance to eclipse him, to win the final, absolute favor of Stalin. His ambition was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Stalin summoned them both to the Kremlin. In a room thick with the smoke from his pipe, he unrolled a map. With a wax pencil, he drew the lines of advance for their 2 fronts. Zhukov's line pointed directly at the heart of Berlin. Konev's ran parallel, further to the south. But then, Stalin did something deliberately cruel. The demarcation line between the 2 marshals stopped 50 kilometers short of the city. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, someone asked who would take the capital. Stalin looked at his 2 marshals, a malevolent glint in his eyes, and spoke the words that would unleash a bloodbath. Whoever gets there first. The race had begun. Stalin had not only ordered the destruction of Berlin, but he had weaponized the egos of his 2 best commanders, using them to ensure relentless speed, no matter how many of their own men died in the process. Facing them was General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, a defensive genius, nicknamed our Poison Dwarf by his troops for his short stature and sharp tongue. Heinrici was a realist in a world of fantasy. He knew he could not stop the Soviet steamroller. His only goal was to save as many soldiers and civilians as he could. While Hitler in his bunker moved ghost armies on maps, Heinrici executed a masterful defense with the remnants of his army. Guessing Zhukov's plan, just before the monstrous artillery bombardment began, he pulled his men back from the first line of trenches. Much of Stalin's fury fell on empty earth. He had prepared his real defense on the most formidable terrain east of Berlin, the Silo Heights. Zhukov, the marshal of brute force, was about to run head-on into the master of cunning defense, and Konev, the marshal of speed, was waiting for his chance to the south. Stalin's trap was perfectly set. Zhukov's plan for the assault on the Silo Heights was pure theater and force. Just after the artillery barrage, as his tanks and infantry advanced in the pre-dawn darkness, he ordered 143 anti-aircraft searchlights to be switched on and aimed directly at the German positions. The idea was to blind and terrorize the defenders. It was a spectacular failure. The light from the searchlights reflected off the smoke and dust kicked up by the Soviets' own artillery, creating a wall of diffused light. Instead of blinding the Germans, the searchlights perfectly illuminated the advancing waves of Soviet soldiers, turning them into easy targets for Heinrich's machine guns and anti-tank cannons. Zhukov's attack devolved into a slaughter. His men and tanks bogged down in the ground deliberately flooded by the Germans and met a fierce, well-prepared resistance. The Marshal of Victory was stuck, his divisions decimated, his timetable in tatters. Every meter of the Silo Heights was paid for in Soviet blood. Meanwhile, further south, Konev's assault across the Nisa River was a model of speed and efficiency. Using smoke screens instead of searchlights, his forces crossed the river with relative ease and, once on the other side, his tank armies found open country. They were unleashed, advancing tens of kilometers on the first day. Konev saw his golden opportunity. Zhukov's hammer was bogged down. Konev's spear was free. He immediately contacted Stalin. With Zhukov stalled, he requested permission to turn his two tank armies, the spearhead of his front, to the north, directly towards Berlin, directly into the operational zone assigned to Zhukov. Zhukov, upon hearing of this, was enraged. He called Stalin in a fit of anger, protesting that his rival was encroaching on his path to glory. But Stalin, relishing the competition he had created, saw that Konev's plan guaranteed the speed he craved. He gave his permission. The humiliation of one marshal became the fuel for the ambition of the other. The race to Berlin was no longer an implicit strategy. It was a direct, frantic order. Two Soviet fronts, instead of cooperating, would now fiercely compete to be the first to reach the heart of the beast, unleashing a storm of fire and steel on the doomed capital. For 3 bloody days, from April 16th to 19th, the Silo Heights became a hellscape. Zhukov, humiliated and furious, abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He simply threw wave after wave of men and tanks against Heinrich's defenses. It was a tactic of primitive brutality, to saturate the German defenses with so many bodies and machines that they would eventually have to break. And eventually, they did break. The cost was horrific. Zhukov lost over 30,000 men and hundreds of tanks in just 3 days to advance a few kilometers. But he had opened the way. His first Belarusian front, battered but unstoppable, began to roll across the plains toward Berlin. The race was now at its peak. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday, Zhukov's long-range artillery began shelling the center of Berlin, a macabre birthday present for the Führer. That same day, Konev's armored spearheads, having swung north at breathtaking speed, entered the southern suburbs of the city. Konev was winning. In the Führer bunker, reality was disintegrating. Hitler, hunched over his maps, ordered armies that no longer existed to launch impossible counterattacks. Meanwhile, in the streets above, the city was transforming into a labyrinth of death. Soviet T-34 and IS-2 tanks, designed for the vast steppes, found themselves in an environment for which they were not prepared. Every street was a shooting gallery. From the windows of ruined buildings, from bomb craters, from dark cellars, the German defenders lay in wait. A 14-year-old Hitler youth boy, his eyes wild with fear and fanaticism, would wait with a Panzerfaust, a single-shot rocket launcher. He would wait for the Soviet tank to pass, aiming for its thin side or rear armor. A hiss, an explosion, and a 40-ton steel coffin would be burning in the middle of the street. Soviet tank losses were catastrophic. The Soviets adapted. They learned to fight the rat war. Assault groups, comprised of infantry, engineers with explosives, and a supporting tank, would advance house by house, floor by floor. They blew holes through walls to avoid the streets, fighting savage, close-quarters combat in living rooms, kitchens, and stairwells. On April 25th, the pincers closed. Zhukov's forces from the east met Konev's from the south, completely encircling Berlin. That same day, further west, Konev's men linked up with American troops on the Elbe River, cutting what was left of Germany in two. Now the final agony of the city began. The battle for Tempelhof Airport was ferocious. The defenders used the subway tunnels, the U-Bahn, to move around the city and launch surprise attacks, forcing the Soviets to fight both above and below ground. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev reached an absurd and tragic climax. In the confusion of the urban fighting, their units would sometimes fire on each other, mistaking their comrades for the enemy in their haste to advance faster than the neighboring front. Men who had survived 4 years of war died by friendly fire in the final battle, victims of their marshal's ambition. The ultimate objective, the symbolic prize of the entire war for Stalin, was the Reichstag, the old German parliament building. Though it had no strategic value, its capture represented the total defeat of Nazism. The task of taking it fell to Zhukov's troops, who had won the race to the city center. The battle for the Reichstag was one of the bloodiest of the entire war. The building, with its thick stone walls, had been turned into a fortress, defended by a garrison of sailors, SS soldiers, and foreign volunteers. The Soviets had to cross the Spree River under murderous fire over the Moltke Bridge and then assault the building, fighting for every room and every hallway. It was medieval combat in a 20th century setting. They fought with grenades, flamethrowers, and fixed bayonets in the grand halls of the parliament. Finally, on the night of April 30th, 2 Soviet sergeants, Meliton Kantaria and Mikhail Yegorov, raised a red flag on the roof. The iconic photo that would commemorate this moment would, in fact, be a staged reenactment days later, a final act of propaganda for a war defined by it. As the red flag flew over the Reichstag, a final drama was unfolding underground. In the Führer bunker, the madness had reached its logical end. With Soviet shells falling on the chancellery, Adolf Hitler said goodbye to his staff, retired to his quarters with Eva Braun, and committed suicide. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted just over 12. Above, the German command structure had completely disintegrated. General Heinrici, the one commander who had kept a clear head, was relieved of his command for ordering a retreat against Hitler's delusional orders. Leadership fell to General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin garrison, whose sole duty was to preside over the death of his city. The fall of Berlin was not just a military victory, it was a social cataclysm. The vengeance that had driven the soldiers of the Red Army from Stalingrad was unleashed upon the civilian population. The city was looted, but most terrible was the wave of sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of German women, from young girls to old women, were raped by Soviet soldiers. It was a grim and brutal consequence of a war that had erased all lines of humanity. The cost of victory, inflated by Stalin's race, was appalling. In just 2 weeks of combat, from the start of the offensive to the city's surrender, Zhukov's and Konev's fronts suffered over 300,000 casualties, killed and wounded. The rush for glory was paid for with the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers who might have been saved with a more coordinated, less competitive plan. The competition, so carefully orchestrated by Stalin, had achieved its goal of speed, but at a human price that would horrify any strategist who valued the lives of his men. The victory was crushing, but the scar it left was deep and lasting. On May 2, 1945, General Weidling surrendered unconditionally to Zhukov's forces. Silence finally fell over the smoking ruins of Berlin. The battle, and with it the war in Europe, was over. Zhukov had technically won the race. His troops had taken the Reichstag and accepted the final surrender. He would be given the honor of presiding over the victory parade in Moscow. But Konev could always argue that his bold armored maneuvers had been more brilliant and that his advance was what had truly sealed the city's fate. The rivalry between them would continue in the halls of Soviet power for years. The final statistics are a testament to the epic scale of the brutality. The Soviets suffered over 81,000 killed or missing and 280,000 wounded. German casualties are harder to calculate, but it is estimated that at least 100,000 soldiers and a similar number of civilians died in the battle for their capital. The Battle of Berlin was the apotheosis of the Red Army's victory, the final, absolute destruction of the Nazi war machine. It was the ultimate revenge for Operation Barbarossa. Yet the story of the deliberately fostered race between Zhukov and Konev is a dark case study in how personal ambition, power politics, and the whim of a dictator can transform a strategic victory into an unnecessarily greater human sacrifice. The ruins of Berlin did not remain silent for long. The divided city, with the western sectors occupied by the Allies and the eastern sector under Soviet control, instantly became the epicenter of a new conflict, a Cold War that would define the rest of the 20th century. The last battlefield of the Second World War became the first front line of the next.